Hi and welcome to this show where we talk to artists, theatre makers, filmmakers, conversations really around the idea of producing narrative, creating form, and thinking about content and reflecting on it. And it also does seem to be a rather interesting time for theatre, urban Indian contemporary theatre. A rather interesting era and a lot of different kinds of experiments that seem to be kind of stabilizing a little bit. And on this occasion, we have with us Neel Chaudhari from the Tadpole Repertory, Delhi, who's been in Bangalore and performing in the recent times for the Rangashankara Theatre Festival. So we thought we could talk a little bit about your journey, because it's also been you also have been categorized as a young theatre maker, and it seems like an interesting time for people who have been associated with theatre, urban theatre, for some time. And there's a celebration as well in terms of this new emergence in terms of talent, and also forms that are creating a new structure to create theatre. So how do you feel about sort of having a theatre repertory in this context in 2017, sustaining it, running it? What have your experiences been with theatre?
Um, so when we say repertory, I must make a clarification here, because a repertory in the traditional sense of the theatre is a body or a group of people that work full time and work exclusively for sort of one theatre or one company under one umbrella. And when we decided to call ourselves Tadpole Repertory, we knew in that moment that the traditional idea of the repertory was impossible. And also when one refers to repertory, one is usually talking largely about a group of actors.
Right.
But what had happened by the time we formed as Tadpole, which is around 2009, even though all of us had been working together for 3 years prior to that under an institution called First City Theatre Foundation. When we decided to call ourselves a repertory, the idea wasn't that, okay, where this body of people only work together and they work exclusively on material by Tadpole, and we pay them all salaries to keep them kind of, exclusive to our sort of, or their commitment to us. That wasn't the idea. Because the other side to a repertory is to the functioning of a repertory. It's a group of people whose careers and sort of artistic journey allies together. Now, in the context of independent Indian theatre, particularly in sort of urban cities, there are great challenges, of course. The most significant of them being funding. And because of the funding challenge, you can't really actually run a full-time repertory. You can't pay people salaries enough for them to live in the city and work exclusively on theatre work. So the idea that theatre actors and artists and directors and technicians and designers all understand that their commitment to the theatre requires a certain amount of time, but at the same time they have to account for their own sort of financial well-being. So all of us who work in the independent theatre either manage another job alongside or do a number of little jobs here and there to earn our money. So in purely professional terms of how that works structurally in a repertory, we're not a repertory in the traditional sense. We pay people per project and per engagement. But one thing that we do maintain is that even though we do general auditions every time for every new production, so really anybody can audition for a piece of work, we have a commitment to developing long-term relationships with people, and not just actors. In fact, all our designers currently have worked with us for at least 5 years, and the idea is that even though artistic development and sort of creative journeys happen on an individual level, because with Tadpole we think of ourselves very much as a collective, we understand that there's also a collective growth. The group itself has an artistic identity and an integrity and a development that is that really rests on the cumulative commitment of these people and decisions and choices that you make together.
Right.
And so as a repertory, I think over the last 10 years, if one were to include the time we were at First City, we've really, that journey has been very engaging because even though in our initial sort of a few years, most of the work was written and directed by me. There's still a very strong involvement by the other creative partners in the process. So, particularly in writing and dramaturgy, I've always collaborated with actors. It's only been a couple of occasions when I've gone into the process of making a play with a full script.
Right.
Often it's just a framework of an idea or frameworks for characters, and then the script is built with the actors. So we've followed a process on many productions, including the most recent one, Quicksand, where a play is cast before there is a script, and then the script really evolves itself to the actors that are present or that are part of the process. So, I mean, that's really how we function as a repertory, and people have joined more recently and people have left. And most crucially, I think everybody, almost most of us, also work with other people. We work with other companies, we collaborate with other artists, we travel. And I think all of this, because we have a very assimilative practice, our pedagogy is quite open, and we really, in terms of how our sort of artistic language has grown, it's very often been people bringing in new ideas, new processes, new structures into the space, and then we kind of play with it. And then if it really works for the kind of language and artistic language that we practice, it becomes assimilated into the pedagogy.
Right.
So it's really a sort of, in some senses, it's quite a sort of bastardized pedagogy, but it's very unique to us.
So in a way, what you say is also that theatre still remains, presents a lot of challenges in terms of running it, and but it also offers so much because, like you said, different people are bringing in different experiences, forms, and then you're creating together as well with actors. And this term that you've used, which is devised text performances. So in a way, as a writer, you're also talking about collaborating with performers and
Yes.
forms. So can you tell us a little bit about how you see it, or how it's been in terms of writing that comes first, and then how you bring in these inputs either through form or experiences? How does it happen at Tadpole?
So something got established from our very first production, which is called Positions. And in Positions, what happened was we started with a very small piece of, it's almost non-fiction text actually. It's a short piece by Margaret Atwood. It's called Happy Endings. And Happy Endings is a piece where she effectively talks about the nature of stories and how each story is really a repetition of an earlier story or a previous story. And so her ultimate point at the end is that the way stories begin or end has become less interesting than the stretch in between. So the how in a story, how do things happen, or why, is really more interesting than what happens. And in today's day and age, when we're inundated with stories, what is happening is less interesting a challenge, because the audience is always confronted with a what and after a what, and that's really what Margaret Atwood's piece was about. And we were in a bit of a jam actually, because we were supposed to do a play and one of the actors quit, and then we had an auditorium booking, we had a sponsor, and we were a month away, and we had no text, and I was unwilling to just pick up any random text and direct it. So I really sat down with 4 actors and I said, look, I have this idea of doing 6 vignettes around this idea, and each of the vignettes has a similar resolution, but really what happens in the middle is what we're going to kind of play around with. And at that time we were all quite young, most of the actors were in their early 20s, and they were really game to just go into the space and play. And the structure that they developed in that production was that I would go in with story outlines and character outlines. We would improvise and play around with it, and at the end of a couple of sessions we would really formulate a scene structure. And in fact, on that production, the first version of that production, there was no bound script even at the end of it. Actors had certain marks that they had to hit, and certain sort of moments that we had identified, but really most of it, including a lot of the dialogue, was improvised. And something about that play really struck a chord, not just with us as a way of working, but also the audience that came. And then progressively that became a sort of foundation structure with which we used to work very often, which is we used to cast a play. And I would usually bring in the framework of an idea or sometimes characters, and then we would spend a great deal of time workshopping. So we're very fortunate as a company to have our own space, a rehearsal space. It's like it's a tiny basement studio, but it allows us the luxury of time. And when actors can commit to a workshop period, it really, to me, enriches a production greatly, because you begin not with the pressure of, oh, we have a show at this auditorium on this date, so pick up your script, learn your lines, and that's your mark and that's your spot, which I feel is a really dead form of making theatre for me. So this initial period of workshopping where actors tussle with formal elements, performance elements, but also narrative elements, character, narrative logic, that becomes a really interesting period for me as a writer, because I'm really sort of in some ways almost a parasite on what is happening. And I spend most of that period of time just extensively taking notes. And a lot of that becomes the raw material and for the script. And we followed that procedure on at least 6 or 7 of our productions so far, including Quicksand, the most recent one. And with Quicksand, it's interesting because we did a workshop in May. I cast the play in May, and we did a workshop with 6 actors actually. We invited 2 extra actors. And then the idea was that in June, July and August, I would write a first draft. And I wrote about 6 scenes, and then when I was going through the scenes, the politics of the play was extremely skewed. I felt towards one character, and one of the things that this play is trying to do is create some sense of doubt about who you're kind of following, who you're empathizing with. And to me, that was not happening. And so almost just a week before the actors came in, we had a meeting, and I said, look, I have to change the characters around. I have to exchange their sort of class backgrounds. And so what happened then with this play is that I started writing when we went into rehearsal. So we spent a lot of time of actors improvising scene structures and their characters. So I had a good sense of what their characters were, but what actually happens within the scenes we improvised. We had rough notes for about 14 scenes, and we ended up picking 9 out of that. So that's the other thing, is that you do create moments and possibilities, and then you pick. And to be very honest, it was a bit nerve-wracking because 2 things were happening. It was a very emotionally draining process, because actors had to visit aspects of themselves or people that they knew or other people's stories that were disturbing and that were upsetting. And for me also to be in rehearsal and to go through rehearsal and then have to go back and write it, it was quite a strain. And the other thing is, curiously, in the last 2 months, things were happening in the, if one were to say, the outside world, online, in kind of social media, that were reframing the work that we were doing. And after a point, we really had to almost ignore that and say that, look, this is what we've chosen to do. Now, just because there's a new story every 3 days, does one respond to that? Does one stay aware of it but still kind of go on our journey? And so the writing process got extended to the extent that the last scene was written and presented to the actors 5 days before we opened. And that's like really for us cutting it a bit too fine. But I was very fortunate because I was very lucky in casting, and the 4 actors developed a very, very unique and special relationship with each other. Right. I've worked with all 4 of them before, and many of them have worked with each other, but there was something about that core presence in rehearsal, the 4 of them, that allowed us to take that risk of writing so late. And they really sort of committed to it. I think they all felt very passionately about the play, and so that's really been our process at Tadpole, is to write through rehearsal. And then what happens in performance is then the writing gets refined. So we've had plays that have been performed over 2 or 3 years, and every now and then we return to the script and say that, what if we were to edit this way? And there have been plays where scenes have been restructured just because we're going back to the play with fresh eyes. And I suppose that's one of the really wonderful things about theatre, is that you can do that. You can say, okay, for this run of shows, let's try this. Right. And I think that's one of the benefits of working in the theatre as opposed to mediums that are more sort of definite.
True.